A great pleasure to welcome this evening Peter Williams. Peter, of course, is known to quite a large number of our club anyway, because Peter obviously was a member some time ago, and maybe on this evening we might even persuade him to rejoin us, rejoin our merry band. Peter has an illustrious career in terms of journalism and TV production, together, of course, with his wife Jo, who was also very much a journalist in the same mould. And Peter has produced an enormous number of documentaries, which have obviously been featured on most of the major television channels. Not only that, of course, he's obviously played a very important role in the life of Kent in numerous ways, with Canterbury Festival, Canterbury Marlowe Theatre, etc., etc. I won't go on further, but it's lovely for him to be joining us this evening. And before he actually starts his presentation, you'll see on the screen the cover of his book in black and white, which I recently finished reading, and it's a wonderful book. Peter has actually made a special effort this evening and said he is very happy very happy to make this available to us and to our friends here tonight at a special price of £15, including postage and packing. So if any of you are interested, then just drop me a line and I will coordinate with Peter in terms of his book. I can thoroughly recommend it. It took me a few evenings of really interesting facts and figures, and you'll see some of the faces on the screen now, which are depicted obviously in that book in words. So without further ado, Peter, the floor is yours, and we're looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much, Les. It's good to be back. I have a very fraternal feeling, and I was, of course, when I was in the club, there were no ladies, and my goodness to me, you do make the right decisions in the end, don't you? The book is called, as you can see, in black and white. It's about how and why a community has been assembled in Kent over 100 years. How men with their families, steeped in industry and its ways, settled into a predominantly agricultural community. And it's about the attributes that they brought with them to enrich the Kent community. In a way, it's been a book which is 50 years in the writing, and I'll try and explain why. I'm an incomer myself. I'm Welsh. We won't talk about the rugby. And I was in the 1960s living in Bristol and working for the Bristol Evening Post. Television was the new kid on the block, and I was eager to be part of it. My first job in television was in Dover as a newsreader and a reporter for the nightly magazine program Day by Day, working for Southern Television as they opened their new regional ITV station for the Southeast. The region stretched from Brighton and Worthing to Reading and on to Margate and the Channel ports. The studio was a converted bus garage. I came to Kent on a 6-month contract, and I've stayed here for 50 years and more. I came to know the Southeast pretty well, and I don't have to tell you that it's a lovely part of the world. During that first 6-month contract while I was here, I clearly remember noting that the unique story of the Kent Coalfield had never properly been documented. On reflection, I think that's an understatement, because at first, when I first came from Wales, I was completely unaware that there was a coal mine that it even existed in Kent. Throughout a long career making documentaries for the major networks, as Les has been kind enough to say, I tried consistently and from time to time to persuade the major channels, BBC, ITV, Channel 4, Discovery, and others, to commission a film on a century of coal in Kent. There were no takers. I found that odd then, and I still find it odd today, because this is a unique story. Nowhere else in the world has an established community accommodated an influx of tens of thousands of workers over such a relatively short period of time. This new unique community in Kent has survived 2 world wars, a multitude of industrial disputes, the closure of the mines, and the subsequent grinding poverty as fossil fuel that had founded the Industrial Revolution gave way to new people-friendly energy. It is a great story, and it started like this. Coal was discovered in Kent quite by accident in the 1890s, when men first thought of linking Britain to France through a tunnel. 95 years ago, there were plans at the highest level of the UK government to turn East Kent into, and just listen to this, a new black country of coal mines and ironworks. Neville Chamberlain, then Minister of Health, but soon to become Britain's Prime Minister, came to Canterbury Cathedral on July the 24th, 1926. Thank you, Don. He gave a speech there to the county's political and business leaders, outlining a scheme to create up to 18 coal mines and a number of ironworks between Canterbury and the coast, embracing Dover and Deal and Thanet. There were, at that time, already 4 working collieries in Kent, and they were at Snowdown, Tilmanston, Chislet, and Betshanger. And geological surveys at the time indicated rich seams of coal elsewhere in the county, with deposits of iron ore nearby. Well, speculators and investors became, as you can imagine, very excited. The pessimists forecast that this was going to be the end of the Garden of England as we know it. So Chamberlain's job in Canterbury Cathedral that day in 1926 was to mollify the critics, to forecast undreamed of prosperity for Kent, and to stress that the development of these huge deposits of coal, only 60 miles from an expanding and coal-hungry London, was an economic imperative for Great Britain, for the nation. It was in the nation's interests. That day, Chamberlain skillfully delivered a very seductive argument, and the audience, I think quite surprisingly, was broadly convinced. Well, the impact on Kent was immediate. This was the era of the Depression. None of you, of course, will remember that, but there were many job-hungry miners who flocked in their tens of thousands to the county, to its newly developed and developing collieries. They brought with them their families, and Kent was fortunate in that the man charged with creating homes for them was a man called Patrick Abercrombie. Now, Abercrombie was a great man. He was later to be knighted for his inspirational work in rebuilding the cities of Hull and Plymouth and London, which were blitzed during the Second World War. And here he is on the screen now, on the left there, showing his plans for the rebuilding of London to Her Majesty, His Majesty the King and Her Majesty the Queen. He was an extraordinary man. To sum him up, Abercrombie was a planning pioneer. He decided we weren't simply talking about houses, we were talking about communities. He built communities. And he planned, and again, this I hope will surprise you, he planned 8 new towns in East Kent. And the first, Aylsham, was started straight away. Towards the end of his life, Abercrombie rated the insertion of an industrial community into a predominantly agricultural county as perhaps the greatest challenge of his career. And it was a long and distinguished career. And of course, as we all now know, the ambitious plan was never completed. A Second World War and the reduction in the need for coal as the motive power for the world's economies saw to that. Coal was no longer king. So 7 of the 8 new towns planned for Kent were never started. And the 8th, Aylsham, was only half finished. We'll come back to Aylsham later. Instead, I'm going to tell you about one miner, a man called Malcolm Pitt. Pitt by name and Pitt by nature. Now, I never met Malcolm Pitt, but I know him very well because Malcolm Pitt left a message in the form of notes and a manuscript that gave a detailed insight into the dedication, the pain, the hard work, the comradeship and the conflict that was the everyday life of everyone who has ever been dropped like a stone down a shaft thousands of feet deep to earn a living digging coal. That's him on the right, by the way. Malcolm Pitt was a remarkable man. He was the first in his family even to go ever to go to university. He had at least 2 careers. First, he was a teacher in Broadstairs, during which he met his wife Elizabeth at a Saturday night dance. She was studying at the Maria Assumpta College in Kensington, and Malcolm, who was already a Christian, converted to Catholicism. Elizabeth too became a teacher, and they married and had 3 daughters. I've met the family, they're great. Malcolm decided to take the equivalent of a master's degree at university, and this definitely sharpened his political appetite. He joined the Communist Party. Throughout his life, Malcolm Pitt, academic, father of 3, loved to explore possibilities, as he put it. He would spend hours discussing what his wife Elizabeth describes as the meaning of life. The experience of university seemed to have unsettled him. He questioned everything. He questioned his faith, society's morals, attitudes. He questioned capitalism and the way we lived. He wanted to help those who couldn't help themselves. He wanted to taste what it was like to be a manual worker. And so he became a miner. He enrolled at the Tilmanston pit in the Kent Coalfield. His parents, who had brought him up, a very bright-eyed youngster, and watched him follow the road to academia, were, well, surprised, I think is probably an understatement, putting it mildly. Malcolm was a miner for 14 years. For 7 of those years, he worked at the coal face. He suffered from eczema related to the conditions he worked in every day of his life, this life underground. He once narrowly escaped serious injury and emerged with a damaged hand. I'm very grateful to him for leaving notes and the manuscript. It's precise and evocative, recording what it was like to work in Tilmanston in the 1970s. His strong, angular writing leans to the left, which is, I think, appropriate. The word pictures he draws are both clear and poetic and affectionate and bitter. It's one of the best informed descriptions of life as a miner that I know. For that reason, I quote from his writing freely in the book. Malcolm wrote of his job, and these are direct quotes from it: "The pit dominates the life of a mining community, far more than the factory influences the lives of other sections of the industrial working class. Though the pit villages of Elvington and Aylsham and Mill Hill are situated some distance from the collieries, the pit head is never far from sight. The gear heads are permanent reminders of the underground world which mold and controls the lives of the miners and their wives and their children, their families. They mark the entrance to a totally different world of toil and danger and death. Even for the men who work down the pit, it's completely beyond the powers of imagination to conceive every day that 2,000 or 3,000 feet below the fields, marshes and orchards, there are hundreds of men working at the coal. Similarly, when a man is working underground, he finds it equally impossible to relate in any real terms to the world on top, the world he won't see until the end of his shift. I'd just like to pause there for a moment. Is there any other job, any other way of earning a living that so divides a man from everyday life? Maybe in a submarine, but then you get leave, don't you, from a submarine? Mining is an incessant everyday demand. Mining is an insulation that could encourage, if you see what I mean, isolation, insulation and isolation. And you'll see that that's actually what happened. I'm reminded of what Tom Benner, a board member of the Pittsburgh Coal Mining Institute of America, wrote in 1960. And it gives a feel of the isolation of a miner. He wrote, "Dark? You've never seen dark till you've seen a dark in a coal mine." Mining is a unique occupation. It really is. Some of those who came to Kent to hew its coal didn't find it an easy transition. They met uncertainty and they met hostility. When they shopped, their wives were offered what was called miner's bacon. It was streaky, it was substandard, it was an insult. When miners bought a home, or when they were looking for a home, or even somewhere to rest their heads, a room perhaps for the night, the cards in the boarding house windows read quite clearly, "No miners." It was hurtful, and it's an attitude experienced for many immigrants, I guess, who go to strange lands. And make no mistake, these men and women from Scotland and Wales and Newcastle and Nottingham and the West Country and elsewhere might just as well have been moving to a foreign country. That's maybe something to remember, perhaps, in this shifting world of today. These men had many things in common, and they found both strength and comfort in their shared experience. They were, for instance, living with danger every day of their lives. I quote Malcolm Pitt again. "The risk of death or injury is part of the common currency of conversation in a pit. The shafts of the Kent pits have always been associated with the death of men." He went on, "Death and injury are rarely discussed without becoming the subject of a grim joke. During one snap time," snap is the food that the miner takes down with him because he can't come up. It takes a long time to have his meal. Snap is a meal. During one snap time at Tilmanston, Pitt wrote, "The men were eating their sandwiches sitting together in the roadway and discussing what it was like to be dead. One of them said, 'It can't be that bad.' His name was Nobby Clark. 'It can't be that bad,' he said. 'Only one man's ever come back, and he didn't hang around for too long, did he?'" These searing observations are a common tradition of the coalfield. They're told by a father to his sons and by experienced miners, instructors to their trainees. They become part of the bloody backcloth against which the miner carries on his working life. The book in black and white charts daily detail of life underground through Malcolm Pitt's eyes. Pitt also describes, from his point of view, the political and terminal battle with Margaret Thatcher and the Tory government in 1984 that changed the face of industrial relations in Britain and led to the closure of Britain's mining industry. His observations are vivid and often bitter. He is proud of the militancy of the Kent Coalfields, the only coalfield to go on strike, for instance, during World War II. Betts Hangar was the last pit to close in Kent in 1989. It was the end of an era. Towards the end of his life, Malcolm Pitt became disillusioned with the Communist Party. He wrote about it that living tradition becomes replaced by doctrine and dogma that legitimizes the exercise of absolute power by a minority, or even by one man or woman, sometimes with the full coercive power of the state. Malcolm Pitt turned again to Christianity and to study. In that time, during those years, Elizabeth Pitt told me, he began to assess his own life, and he picked over what he had done and what he hadn't done. In 1990, an old Catholic friend, Bishop John Jukes, some of you may have known him, offered him a part-time job to run a Catholic initiative, the World of Work. He explored his Christian faith again, and eventually Malcolm Pitt became principal of the Franciscan International Study Centre at the University of Kent. Malcolm was 65 years old. He was still smoking heavily. Elizabeth told me, I think he knew he was dying. He began a Master of Arts degree and thought of little else. When he felt well enough, he would wake early and work at it all day. As I say, he was a driven man. The subject that Malcolm chose was interesting, a cultural study in cosmology and divination, God and Mammon. It was for him the tug of war or tug of love that was the basis of everything Malcolm Pitt ever achieved. On the last day of his life, Malcolm awoke and asked Elizabeth, please get for me my manuscript. Elizabeth remembers that. That's my last memory of him. It was typical. Malcolm Pitt's story is remarkable. But then, most miners are remarkable. His story is one of so many. After his death, Malcolm was awarded his MA on the basis of the unfinished paper, because he never finished his dissertation. He was 66 when he died. His 10-year-old grandson, Aidan Pitt Davis, received the degree on Grandpa's behalf, watched and applauded by a full congregation in Canterbury Cathedral. It's appropriate, I think, that we end where I started, in Canterbury Cathedral, where in 1926, Neville Chamberlain revealed the image of a new black country in Kent. Chamberlain gave Patrick Abercrombie, the architect, the task of bringing that dream to reality, and Aylsham was to be the first of the 8 new towns in the county. But even Aylsham was only half finished. But what graced Kent about this whole story was the injection of new people who brought with them their own traditions and heritage in music and rugby, of course, and whippet racing and creativity in so many fields. For me, this whole experience has been rewarding. To visit Scotland and Wales and Yorkshire, to meet relatives of the miners and sometimes the miners themselves, to explore the reasons why miners up to left homes and families to trek to the new world of Kent. Unsurprisingly, the motivation in each place has much in common. relationships between mine owner and mine worker in those days could hardly have been worse in the 1920s and the 1930s. There were rare and conspicuous exceptions where the mine owners and the miners worked together happily. Tilmanston is an example, a very happy pit. Mine owners wanted to cut wages and were slow to invest in safety measures and new equipment. This is generally speaking. Miners generally showed their resentment to this treatment by working to rule and withdrawing their labor. There was anger and fault on both sides. After all, one man's strike is another man's lockout. So during the Depression, the Kent Coalfield presented a new challenge in a new location. Perhaps it was utopia, without the bitterness of existing relationships in the mines that these men were leaving behind them. Were they seeking perfection? I don't know that, but they were certainly seeking a fresh start. Today, most residents of Aylsham acknowledge that if there has been a schism between them and the rest of East Kent, they are as much to blame as anyone. Yet isolation, imposed or self-inflicted, can also be interpreted positively as self-sufficiency. Aylshamers, justifiably, have said to themselves, why leave our neighborhood, our town, if everything we need is here, plus the sun and the sea and the sand, which our family never experienced in South Wales or the Black Country or the Northeast. It is an understandable argument, particularly if you feel surrounded by hostility from folk born and bred in the Garden of England. It's a hostility real or imagined. It's necessary to say that. Lastly, then, I'd like to quote from Dr. David Hornsby, who is studying this unique community in East Kent and its own special dialect in a course at the University of Kent. He told me one day, I have never found a place with such warmth and community spirit as Aylsham in Kent. And that's quite an assessment, isn't it? For me then, it's been a privilege to be trusted by these mining folk to put on the record the story of a community that is genuinely unique. And the telling of the story, in my view, is long overdue. And if there are any questions, I'll be happy. If there aren't, then we can all go home. But if there are any questions, I'll be happy to answer them.
Thank you, Peter. For the rest of us, Peter's book is excellent and it fills in everything that he hasn't been saying, had time to talk about tonight, or even respond to in the questions. But not long after I joined the Forest of Blean, I think it was Rotary. We had an outside meeting like no other, and we went down the colliery at Tilmanstone, and it made a great impression on me. Even after a couple of hours down there, everything I was wearing when I got home got sent to the wash straight away, and I was dispatched to the bathroom. And I've had a great regard for miners ever since. Perhaps we should be grateful that Abercrombie's plans were never completely fulfilled, although there might not have been much left for Mr. Quinn to build on after that. But we should be equally grateful for Peter for his expert telling of the story of Kent's now lost and thankfully, thanks to him, not forgotten minefield. So please join me in thanking him for putting so much into letting us into this part of Kent's history, and do buy his book. It is excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Peter.